There is a gas station in rural Kentucky on a two-lane road between Pikeville and Prestonsburg where the price board changed 3 times in the first week of March 2026. The owner, who had run the station for 19 years, told a reporter from a regional paper that he had never seen anything like it, not the prices themselves, which had been higher in inflation-adjusted terms during the summer of 2008, but the speed at which they moved, the sense that the number on the sign was no longer anchored to anything stable. On March 2, regular unleaded was $3.41. By March 8, it was $3.79. By mid-March, it had crossed $4, and drivers who filled up every Monday morning were spending $30 or $40 more per month than they had in January. Some of them began driving less. Some of them began combining trips the way their grandparents had during the oil shocks of the 1970s. And some of them, for the first time in their lives, began searching online for something they had previously considered either a curiosity or a luxury, an electric car. What happened to gasoline prices in the spring of 2026 was not a slow deterioration or a cyclical fluctuation, it was a rupture. On February 28, the United States and Israel initiated military operations against Iran. Within days, the conflict reached the Strait of Hormuz, a passage of water barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply transits on tanker vessels. Iran mined the approaches, deployed fast-attack naval boats, and by mid-March declared the strait closed to commercial shipping. The United States Navy established a full cordon, and satellite tracking showed tanker traffic through the passage dropping to effectively zero. In one stroke, the most critical choke point in global energy infrastructure had been shut. The International Energy Agency, an organization established in 1974 specifically because the world had learned during the Arab oil embargo what happens when oil supplies are politically weaponized, responded on March 11 with the largest coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves in its history. 400 million barrels were pledged by member nations. The United States alone committed 172 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve, the network of underground salt caverns along the Texas and Louisiana coast that had been filled and drawn down and filled again through every geopolitical tremor since the 1970s. The numbers were imposing, but their limitation was mathematical. The world consumes roughly 100 million barrels of oil every day. 400 million barrels, released over weeks or months, could soften the blow but could not replace an open strait. By mid-April, Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, was trading at roughly $96 a barrel, nearly $28 higher than a year earlier. The U.S. national average gasoline price had climbed to $4.13 per gallon. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that gasoline prices in March had surged 21% in a single month, the steepest one-month increase at the pump since 1967. Consumer prices overall jumped 0.9% in March, the largest monthly gain in nearly 4 years, pushing the annualized inflation rate to 3.3% and unwinding months of painstaking progress by the Federal Reserve. Goldman Sachs warned that consumers could not outrun high gas prices for much longer before pulling back on discretionary spending. Small business confidence dropped. Sentiment surveys showed Americans more pessimistic about the economy than at any point since the pandemic. And it was in this atmosphere of fuel anxiety and household budget strain that the electric vehicle, a technology that had been steadily growing for a decade but had never quite broken through the membrane of mainstream urgency, suddenly found itself at the center of a conversation that millions of people were having for the first time, not out of environmental conviction but out of raw economic self-interest. The data arrived quickly and from multiple directions. Edmunds, the automotive research platform, reported that electrified vehicle consideration jumped to 23.8% of all car shopper research activity in mid-March, the highest weekly level of the year. Online searches for electric vehicles surged 17% in a single week as gas prices spiked. The Associated Press interviewed drivers across the country who described the same calculus. They had been vaguely aware that electric cars were cheaper to operate, but the awareness had been abstract. A fact filed away alongside other facts about technologies they would get to eventually. $4 gasoline made the abstraction concrete. The New York Times ran a story under the headline $12 for 2 gallons, profiling Americans who were, for the first time, walking into dealerships and asking about plug-in options not because of climate change or technological enthusiasm, but because they could no longer afford not to. The arithmetic that drove this shift was not complicated, but it was powerful. At $4 a gallon, a driver covering the American average of 12,000 miles per year in a conventional sedan getting 25 miles per gallon was spending roughly $1,900 annually on fuel. The same distance in a comparable electric vehicle charged predominantly at home on overnight residential electricity rates cost approximately $600. The difference, $1,300 a year, was large enough to be felt in any household budget, but especially in those where fuel costs represented a significant share of monthly expenses. Over 5 years, a study cited by multiple outlets calculated a typical gas car burned through approximately $9,000 in fuel at recent prices, while a comparable EV used roughly $2,250 of electricity. The gap had always existed, but at $3 a gallon it was possible to wave it away. At $4, and with every news bulletin carrying the possibility of 5, the gap became the most compelling argument in automotive marketing, not delivered by any advertisement but by reality itself. The response was not uniform across the world, but the pattern was remarkably consistent. In Europe, where fuel prices had risen roughly 12% between late February and mid-March, the shift was immediate and dramatic. Reuters reported that March 2026 was a record-breaking month for European EV sales, the first month of global EV sales growth driven principally by a fuel crisis rather than by subsidies or mandates. In Germany, Europe's largest automotive market, registrations of pure battery electric vehicles surged 66% in March compared to the previous year, reaching nearly 71,000 units. Electric cars accounted for 24% of all new car sales in the country, with plug-in hybrids adding another 10%. Tesla's registrations in Germany alone leaped 315% year over year to a record of over 9,000 units, a figure driven not by any new model launch, but by the simple fact that filling a Tesla with electricity cost a fraction of what filling a BMW with petrol now demanded. In the United Kingdom, Bloomberg reported EV sales rising to record highs amid the fuel price surge. Across the European Union more broadly, fully electric car sales in the first quarter jumped by almost a third. Used EV sales in Europe, which had been growing modestly, accelerated sharply as Reuters documented buyers who could not afford a new electric car turning to the second-hand market, where a 3-year-old Renault Zoe or Volkswagen ID.3 offered the same fuel savings at a fraction of the purchase price. The phenomenon was even more striking in Southeast Asia, a region where electric vehicles had until recently been a novelty rather than a market force. In Thailand, where battery-only models had already reached roughly 50% of new car sales by early 2026, the oil crisis pushed adoption further into the mainstream. Indonesia, Southeast Asia's largest economy, saw EV sales nearly double as energy costs climbed. The Jakarta Post reported dealerships overwhelmed by buyers seeking to escape fuel price volatility. Across the region, EV sales jumped 42% in March alone, hitting nearly 16,000 units. Vietnam's VinFast reported a 127% surge in sales. The pattern was consistent. In markets where affordable electric options existed, principally those supplied by Chinese manufacturers, consumers were making the switch with a speed that outpaced every prior forecast. And it was the Chinese dimension of this story that carried the most profound implications for the structure of the global automobile industry. BYD, the Shenzhen-based manufacturer that had grown from a battery supplier into the world's most prolific producer of electric vehicles, acknowledged publicly that the crisis was delivering a windfall. Its overseas orders had surged to what executives described as another level. The company's affordable models, some priced below $15,000 in Asian markets, occupied a segment of the market that no Western manufacturer had yet seriously attempted to serve. Its latest hybrid powertrain, the DMI-5, delivered fuel efficiency figures that rendered traditional combustion engines economically irrational by comparison. Its fast-charging technology, which the company stated could add 2 kilometers of range for every second connected to a charger, was eroding the practical objections that had kept fence-sitters loyal to gasoline. Journalists and analysts drew a historical parallel that resonated with uncomfortable clarity. In the 1970s, the oil crisis had created the conditions under which Japanese automakers, principally Toyota and Honda, had broken into the American market with small, efficient, affordable cars that Detroit had dismissed as unserious. Within a decade, those companies had permanently altered the competitive balance of the global auto industry. The question being asked now, in boardrooms from Detroit to Wolfsburg to Tokyo, was whether 2026 was doing the same thing for Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers. China's EV exports had jumped 140% to 349,000 units in March alone, an extraordinary figure that reflected not merely crisis-driven demand but a structural advantage in manufacturing scale, battery costs, and supply chain integration that had been built over 15 years of industrial policy. The crisis was not creating that advantage, it was revealing it to a global audience that had not been paying close enough attention. The irony embedded in the American response to this moment was difficult to overstate. The Trump administration had, over the preceding year, systematically dismantled the policy infrastructure that had supported domestic EV adoption. The $7,500 federal tax credit for electric vehicle purchases had been eliminated. California's authority to set its own vehicle emission standards, which had historically pulled the national market toward electrification, had been rescinded. Penalties for automakers that failed to meet fuel efficiency targets had been canceled. A 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, originally imposed under the Biden administration, remained in place, effectively barring the most affordable electric vehicles on Earth from American consumers. The stated intent was to protect American industry and lower car prices by removing what the administration characterized as artificial government interference in the market. The effect, at the precise moment when surging oil prices made the economic case for EVs more powerful than at any point in history, was to make electric vehicles harder and more expensive for American buyers to access while simultaneously shielding them from the lowest cost competition. This policy contradiction was not merely theoretical, it showed up in the data. While European and Asian EV markets surged in March and April, the American picture was more ambiguous. Interest rose sharply, as the Edmunds and search data showed, but actual sales growth was constrained by the higher effective cost of purchase in a market stripped of incentives and walled off from Chinese manufacturers. A CNN analysis described the American auto industry as trapped between two contradictory forces, a global crisis that rewarded electrification and a national policy that penalized the fastest route to achieving it. The consumers who most needed relief from fuel costs, rural drivers, low-income workers, people in communities where the nearest charging station was 50 miles away, were precisely those least able to afford a new EV at $53,000, the average transaction price for an electric vehicle in the United States in early 2026, even as that price continued to edge downward. The used EV market offered a partial answer, and in the first quarter of 2026, it became one of the most dynamic segments of American automotive commerce. Approximately 93,500 used EVs were sold in the quarter, a 12% increase over the same period in 2025 and a 17% jump from the previous quarter. A flood of off-lease vehicles, projected to surge 230% compared to 2025, was pushing more affordable electric cars into the market. The Los Angeles Times reported that nearly 40% of used EVs were now selling for under $25,000, and research from Recurrent Auto showed that after 3 years, most EV models retained about 97% of their original battery range, a finding that directly countered the persistent consumer fear that used electric vehicles were ticking time bombs of degradation. For buyers priced out of the new market, a 3-year-old Chevrolet Bolt or Nissan Leaf at $18,000 or $20,000 offered fuel savings that could reach $150 a month, enough to offset a significant portion of the monthly payment itself. But the question that hovered over all of this activity, the question that separated genuine structural transformation from a temporary behavioral blip, was whether the shift would last. History offered a cautionary precedent. In 2008, when oil prices spiked to $147 a barrel during the global financial crisis, American consumers had similarly abandoned large vehicles for smaller, fuel-efficient alternatives. Prius sales surged, analysts declared the end of the SUV era, and then, within 2 years, as oil prices collapsed and the crisis faded from public memory, truck and SUV sales not only recovered but exceeded their pre-crisis peaks. The same pattern had repeated after every oil shock since 1973. Crisis prompted behavioral change, relief extinguished it. A Forbes analysis published in April 2026 argued explicitly that the current EV surge would follow the same trajectory, that the fundamental consumer preference for familiar, gasoline-powered vehicles had survived every previous oil shock intact, and that once the strait reopened and prices normalized, the EV enthusiasm would dissipate like every energy crisis fad before it. The counter-argument, articulated by Reuters and by analysts at organizations like Bloomberg Neff and the think tank Ember, rested on a claim that was structural rather than behavioral. In every previous oil crisis, there had been no viable technological alternative to the internal combustion engine. In 1973, the electric car was a fantasy. In 1979, it was a laboratory experiment. In 2008, it was a concept car at an auto show. But in 2026, the alternative existed at scale. 20 million electric vehicles had been sold worldwide in 2025 alone. Bloomberg Neff calculated that EVs had avoided the consumption of 2.3 million barrels of oil per day in 2025, a figure projected to more than double to 5.25 million barrels by 2030. 39 countries had achieved an EV sales share above 10%, the threshold that technology adoption research consistently identifies as the point beyond which a new technology's growth becomes self-sustaining. The March 2026 data showed global EV market share reaching roughly 27.5% of new car sales, a figure that put electric vehicles past the tipping point in aggregate global terms. The argument was not that consumer psychology had fundamentally changed, because it probably had not, but that the technology had matured to the point where the switch was no longer a sacrifice. It was not, as in 1973, a matter of choosing a smaller and less comfortable car. It was a matter of choosing a car that was, for a growing number of buyers in a growing number of markets, simply better and cheaper to operate regardless of what oil prices did. This did not mean the transition was frictionless or equitable or anywhere close to complete. The constraints were real and unglamorous. The American charging network remained patchy and unreliable, with rural areas particularly underserved. A CoBank report published in April found that rural Americans were absorbing the most acute fuel cost impacts from the Middle East conflict, yet these were precisely the communities where EV infrastructure was thinnest and driving distances were longest. The grid itself, while capable of handling current EV charging loads, faced real stress points at the distribution level. The local transformers and feeder lines that carried electricity to homes. A study published in Nature documented how uncoordinated evening charging by a concentrated number of EVs in a single neighborhood could strain infrastructure never designed for the load, creating brownout risks that would require upgraded equipment and smarter management systems. The solutions existed: smart charging, vehicle-to-grid technology, time-of-use pricing that incentivized overnight charging when the grid had ample spare capacity. But deploying those solutions required coordination between utilities, regulators, and consumers at a pace that the sudden urgency of the crisis had not afforded. Further upstream, the supply chain that fed the electric vehicle industry contained its own set of vulnerabilities and dependencies. China controlled roughly 70% of global lithium-ion battery manufacturing capacity and an even larger share of the mineral processing that preceded it. Lithium itself was adequate for current demand, but analysts warned that if adoption continued to accelerate, shortages could emerge as early as 2028, requiring an estimated $276 billion in new mining and processing investment across multiple continents. Cobalt, much of it sourced from the Democratic Republic of the Congo under conditions that ranged from precarious to exploitative, remained a critical input despite years of effort to engineer it out of battery chemistries. The world was not merely substituting one energy dependency for another, but the geography and politics of the new dependency were different in ways that had not yet been fully mapped. The IEA's April oil market report contained a finding that, stripped of all its technical language, carried a kind of quiet gravity. For the first time since the pandemic-driven collapse of 2020, global oil demand was projected to decline in 2026, contracting by 80,000 barrels per day. This was not because the world was using less energy. It was because the combination of high prices and the ongoing electrification of transport was, at last, bending the demand curve. The decline was small, a rounding error against a market of 100 million barrels a day, but its symbolic weight was enormous, the first non-recessionary contraction in oil demand in the modern era. The world's fleet of electric vehicles, Fortune noted, was already displacing enough oil to account for 70% of Iran's pre-war export volume. The machines that individual consumers had purchased for their own private reasons, whether economy or ideology or simply the pleasure of quiet acceleration, were collectively accomplishing what strategic petroleum reserves and naval deployments and decades of energy policy had not: a measurable, structural reduction in the world's dependence on the most geopolitically volatile commodity in existence. It is tempting to frame this as a simple story of progress, a narrative in which a crisis arrives, an alternative technology rises to meet it, and the world transitions cleanly from one energy era to the next. The reality resists that neatness. The Strait of Hormuz, as of this writing, remains in a cycle of contested closures and fragile reopenings. Oil prices oscillate violently with each diplomatic signal and military incident. The human cost of the conflict that triggered the crisis, with more than 3,400 Iranian casualties reported by mid-April, recedes too easily behind the economic data and market charts. The consumers who are switching to electric vehicles are not, in most cases, making a geopolitical statement. They are responding to a number on a gas station sign that has become intolerable. The consumers who cannot switch, who live in charging deserts or earn wages that preclude a new car purchase at any price, are simply absorbing the cost, cutting other spending, driving less, rearranging the small economies of their daily lives to accommodate a crisis they had no part in creating. What can be said, with reasonable confidence based on the evidence accumulated through the first months of this crisis, is that 2026 is not 1973, and it is not 2008. The difference is not that human nature has changed, or that markets have become wiser, or that governments have learned from the past. The difference is that the technology is ready. When the Arab oil embargo struck in 1973, there was nothing to switch to. When prices spiked in 2008, the Nissan Leaf was still 2 years from production. In 2026, a family in Jakarta can walk into a BYD dealership and drive home in an electric car for a monthly payment comparable to what they now spend on gasoline alone. A retired couple in Bavaria can order a Volkswagen ID.4 and plug it into their home wall box powered partly by rooftop solar panels installed 3 years ago. A delivery driver in Manchester can buy a used Tesla Model 3 for less than he spent on diesel in the last 12 months. These are not hypotheticals. They are transactions happening at a rate of tens of thousands per day across dozens of countries, in a market that reached 20 million annual unit sales before the crisis began and is now accelerating beyond every pre-war forecast. Whether this acceleration will persist when the strait reopens and oil prices eventually normalize, as they have after every previous crisis, is a question that honest analysis cannot definitively answer. The skeptics have history on their side. The pattern of crisis-driven adoption followed by reversion is well documented and deeply rooted in the psychology of consumer behavior. But the structural argument carries its own weight. A car purchased during a crisis does not get returned when the crisis ends. A driver who has spent 6 months paying $60 a month for electricity instead of $200 for gasoline does not easily forget the difference. A country that has watched its economy convulse because a waterway 21 miles wide was blocked by a conflict it had no part in has a new and visceral understanding of what energy independence actually means. And a technology that has reached 27% of global new car sales does not historically retreat. It advances, driven by manufacturing scale, declining costs, improving infrastructure, and the simple compounding logic of a product that, once experienced, renders its predecessor not just expensive but unnecessary. The gas station in eastern Kentucky still stands, its price board still changing with the tides of a distant conflict. But something has shifted in the conversation around it, in the diners and the church parking lots and the Facebook groups where people in small towns talk about what things cost and what to do about it. The electric car is no longer an abstraction discussed by policy experts and technology enthusiasts on the coasts. It is a line item in a family budget calculation, a search query entered at midnight after another $50 fill-up, a used Chevrolet Bolt on a lot 40 miles away that someone's cousin bought last month and swears has saved him $160 already. It is not a revolution. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is arithmetic, tested by crisis, confirmed by experience, and spreading at a pace that no subsidy ever achieved and no embargo ever intended.